So that's wonderful. So I hope you are still feeling energised. Move around a little bit if you need to. Think of your questions. So we've got 15 minutes for some questions. So I think we'll do as before. If you've got a question, come to the mic. And if you could please say who you are and keep your question short and sharp. I'll start with the gentleman over here.
My name is Rainer Sauerborn, and I'm from Heidelberg University, but I've also linked now to Harvard University. I found this fishery project fascinating. My quick question is it because the oceans are too hot, too sour, or too warm? What is the driving force behind this decrease in fishery, apart from overfishing?
Okay, we're going to get one more question. So, Chris, you can be thinking of your answer, and then we'll take those two together.
Hi, my name is Yvonne Sokolar, and I'm a graduate student at Tufts University here. And after some lovely international presentations, my question focuses a little more on the U.S., actually. But I'm wondering, with the change in political climate over the past couple of months, I've been thinking a lot about scientific communication in this age of alternative facts. And I think that we've seen that government agents are relying a lot more on feelings and intuitions when they make policy decisions. And yeah, as a group of people who clearly believe pretty heartily in the scientific method and whose work has vast political and policy implications, I'm just wondering what you think about how acceptable it is to engage in that language of intuition and feeling when talking with policymakers, and if and how you can do that without compromising the scientific legitimacy of the facts you're talking about.
Okay, so Chris, do you want to kick off, and then others may want to think about their response to that second question?
Yeah, thank you for your question, and sorry that I had to breeze through so much of what we've done in a short amount of time, but the focus of that model was really on sea temperature. And so ocean acidification, coral bleaching, all of those things are going to be deeply implicated in driving similar trajectories with the fish declines, but that model was looking very specifically at the role of sea temperature rise on the entire ecological community within the marine system. So it does include all of the biological interactions between phytoplankton to herbivorous fish all the way up the food chain. And it's really estimating, even in a place like British Columbia, which is far removed from the equatorial belt, that many fish species on average will be migrating poleward at a rate of around 10 to 18 kilometers per decade. So even at a place like that, it's still happening at that type of speed. But the data available and the models are not adequate to do that with ocean acidification quite yet. And one of the things that we're hoping to do is to look at this specifically with coral bleaching data moving into the future.
So the second question was really, I think if I'm paraphrasing, in a world of alternative facts, not a complete world, I hope, of alternative facts, what do you think about talking about your research in terms which perhaps has to press sort of emotional buttons rather than using data, given all of your studies very, very data-driven? What do you feel about that? Are you comfortable with that? Perhaps I'm adding some of my own questions in there. And what's the way forward with this sort of research? But perhaps just thoughts and comments from all of you. Who's going to start?
I'm getting pointed to, so I guess I'll start. I'm probably not the perfect person to discuss this, but I think that there is going to be an increasing role of the importance of storytelling and narratives around research. I think that democratizing science and having these decision support tools like we are trying to create and that Miriam demonstrated in her actual presentation are going to be really important so people can see things for themselves. They can manipulate the tool, they can understand the way that the data works and the model works, and simplifying our messages. We can't maintain this very narrow focus on kind of the egghead ivory tower community. We really need to figure out ways of disseminating this information broadly in an accessible way. So I think that by doing this through things like decision support tools, storytelling, video, photojournalism, etc., is going to become increasingly important. But to make sure that the quality of the messages that we're saying is not diminished in those varieties of formats.
I'll just add briefly, that was a good answer, to a very bad question. Well, a good question, but very difficult question. I'll just add briefly that I think the solutions focus is really key. The message is falling on deaf ears, really. We don't need to elaborate more about the problem necessarily until we can, make a roadmap for solutions, and then maybe there will be some uptake of those solutions. So.
Might I just add another comment on? I mean, I agree with the notion it has to be concentrated on solutions of how we can proceed. But I think there's also an issue that we know already most of the elements. Most of the story is not very complicated, and that is simply we are overusing natural resources and overexploiting them, and that we have to find a way of doing that less. And I think, therefore, we have to work out a way of conveying a very simple narrative, illustrated by the best science and by examples, but to begin much wider public debate than I think we have. From European perspective, I think there is now much wider acceptance and understanding about climate change and the imperatives that that brings and what action has to be taken. But even in that context, which is, I think, probably as advanced discussion as anywhere in the world, it's still not enough about the challenges that have to be met. But that debate needs to go much further. But we don't really need that much more science to do it. We need science to tell us exactly how we can make the most efficient decisions. But the basic principle, the basic messages, I think, are well known.
Yeah, and just to build on that quickly, at least from our perspective looking at fires and land use, there are multiple impacts. I didn't have time to get into this, but public health is a very important one. But then we're also looking at habitat, biodiversity, greenhouse gas emissions. But one exciting thing about the field of planetary health is the impact of fires becomes more concrete when we're starting to look at the impacts on people who are living there. So that's a way that you can tell the story of the research is to focus on how it impacts the people who are living both close by and as we're demonstrating around the region as well.
If I just can add something as well, I echo all the words that have been saying, so I totally agree that storytelling is a big component. At the Hopkins Marine Station, we do a lot of work also on the impact of climate change on the marine communities and looking also at ocean acidification. So every now and then, we actually face this challenge of using what are, for some people, contentious words like climate change itself. So sometimes we just, without compromising the integrity of the science at all, but we try to use words like increased environmental variability that everybody truly experience, and they cannot really, put a sort of a political, values on that, and trying to basically talk about the things that resonate with the community we are talking with.
Great, thank you. Let's pick up these two questions, and then we'll come to your question afterwards, so we keep track of the questions. So there's two more from this side.
Good afternoon. Jabron Mankus, Johns Hopkins School of Nursing. I'm a graduate student there. My question is, in the Planetary Health Alliances talked about this as transdisciplinary, and I think that is really valuable to kind of think that way because it is paradigm changing rather than what has been referred to most of the day about multiple disciplinary and interdisciplinary, and I think I just want to see or hear if how people visualize transdisciplinary bringing in their work.
Daphne Miller, UCSF and UC Berkeley, and I'm a practicing family physician and also a specialist in food systems. And first of all, I want to say thank you. This panel was really fascinating and exciting. Throughout the day, we've heard about the environment and human health, and the arrow tends to go one way in terms of how the environment is impacting human health. And I'm wondering if any of you could speak to research that's going on that's looking at the arrow going the other way, and what happens when we change the quality of our public health. How do we interact with the environment, and how that then changes environmental health? Thank you.
The two great questions there. Who wants to kick off?
I could begin, perhaps. On the question of transdisciplinarity, I think in my own group over the last 15 years or so, we've increasingly tried to bring together different groups. I must say I think there is no substitute for building very long-term relationships across lots of disciplinary areas. So this isn't simply to collaborate to find a group that you can work with just for one or two projects. It's about trying to build up groups which have representation from a wide variety of disciplinary areas for whom you can begin to understand the language that the other speaks and then can develop properly integrated science. That is not the norm. That is not the way a lot of academic rewards are placed. But I think it's a model we need to develop more and more. With regard to the question about the impact of ourselves on the environment, it seems to me that's really a core aspect of so much that we're trying to do, and really goes to the heart of, I'm not going to talk about any scientific examples of that. There are many, I know, but I want to just make a comment on the sort of the principle of it. And it seems to me that we somehow have to, again, address a quite fundamental question for us all, and that is the way in which we learn to value the resources around us, the natural resources around us. It's kind of intriguing that still, even from in our own work, and I no doubt of the value of it, we talk in terms of the economic impact and make the case that if we only looked at trying to address climate change and these other things, there would be an economic benefit to it. Well, so there might be, but I think we have to probably even to start changing the question of what that benefit should be. And still to measure it in economic terms only is not necessarily the thing that's going to deliver us the best for the future. So it's not exactly the answer to the question, but it is simply a plea that we need to, I think, reinterpret some of the values and things that we give value to in terms of relationship between ourselves and the rest of the planet.
Just want to make one mention to the second question here. Someone I feel very privileged to call a colleague and friend who's in the audience over there, Katie Fiorella, just had a publication that came out in PNAS 2 weeks ago that looked at how increasing rates of disease within Lake Vic in Kenya drove increasing environmental destruction with regard to the fisheries there. And it was this kind of coincidence, and I'm going to paraphrase this horribly, of increasing disease and kind of increasing desperation of who can take care of who in the household, and how do you deal with kind of financial despair when those types of diseases arise, and then you can no longer take into consideration these things that then become almost extraneous. So when you have a healthier population, you can have that extra bandwidth to care for the environment and to care for your family, whereas when you don't have that luxury, you are forced into the most efficient way forward. And you very much think on a time scale that is tomorrow rather than the next generation. And so I think that type of research certainly has been underrepresented within this field, but I think that it's also a bit more difficult to study in terms of causation and that kind of cyclical relationship. But you can find her at the poster session and discuss.
So before anyone else answers, you can still hold on to those questions if you want, but we've got 2 more questions. So I want to get those questions in case they were questions you would be happier with. So if you can, as quick as you can with your questions, and then we can use our last 3 minutes well.
Chris, one clarification I need. You are talking about the total fish or...
Yeah, I'm talking about marine wild capture fish.
Yeah. So we have analyzed 10 years data for the East Coast and West Coast of the United States. And what I found that there are some fish species, they are disappearing. Okay. So when you are talking about the total fish...
We need a quick question.
So I do agree that the fish... is very sensitive to the sea surface temperature and also the chlorophyll concentration.
Okay, and our last question?
My name is Miheso Barbara, a research scientist from the Kenya Medical Research Institute. Thank you very much for the lovely presentations. My question is with regards to schistosomiasis, because it's a great problem in Kenya. And we know there are some scientists who are using crayfish to control the snails. And you mentioned about the natural enemies. So which of these natural enemies are most efficient in controlling the snails? And getting rid of the snails, how does that affect the ecosystem? Thank you.
I guess, yeah, that's directed to us. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. Unless you guys want to jump in. No, great questions. Essentially, I guess the most broad answer to that, and the quickest one, is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution when biology and ecology are involved. But that doesn't preclude us from asking the difficult questions and integrating the data from the environmental or ecological components of transmission and harnessing that into solutions appropriate to each place. And with regard to, and so where crayfish are, horribly invasive, we might avoid them. Where maybe they're not, perhaps in certain managed ecosystems, ponds or fish farms or something, maybe they could be useful. Anyhow, it needs to be tailored to the ecological situation. With regards to the snail, the best case study in the history of schistosomiasis control is Japan, who has eliminated completely basically eradicated the disease. And they have the snail now on the endangered species list, but it is not gone. So that is, with all hands on deck and extremely big approach, good economy and all those things, they still couldn't eradicate the snail. We're not worried about the snails disappearing, to be honest. But what we do is we need to get them down back to the levels they were when the environment was not impacted as heavily with human disturbance, and we need to get them below critical community size such that transmission is interrupted, and I think that's a valid goal and a good balance to that.
Okay, is there anyone else on the panel that would like to just address any of the other points that have been raised in our last minus 38 seconds?
Maybe a comment on the transdisciplinary research.
Yeah.
Just, I think we have no option. The problem that we are facing when we look at, increasing public health and protecting our environment are so complex that the traditional sort of incremental way of proceeding, a very narrow disciplinary way, it's very relevant, but might not be sufficient. And we believe that these type of creative solutions might come out by really bringing people from different, perspective, culture, and experience and disciplines together. Even in our project in Senegal, we have about 20 different scientists involved from 9 countries, 5 languages, and 4 continents, and we're trying to get the best for any specific aspect related to prawn aquaculture, to malacology, and to the social science aspect. And that's, present different type of challenges, how to get all these people together, even at the same time, around the world, and talking, a similar language. So I totally echo your word to say this actually requires time to build up a trusting relationship and working together to solve the problem.
Absolutely. So thank you. I think what we've heard this afternoon is this extraordinary breadth, I think, that we've got in terms of topics and therefore the disciplines that need to come together. But the thing that really strikes me as you listen to these talks and you see what's presented is actually the real need for really good data and data analysis and data integration, and that as a skill that needs to be sort of really built in and thought about in terms of sort of career development in this particular area. So something perhaps that we might not think about. But then thinking about the other question about then the communication of what is incredibly interesting and engaging science, and taking Howie's, he's just walked out, but let's his numbers numb. We have all that data, and so how do we then communicate and open up that science in ways that really communicate? So thank you for a wonderful post-lunch session, and if we could give our speakers a show of thanks. And you are all rewarded with a coffee break.